We're supposed to be the dog that keeps nipping at the heels of the powerful. We are supposed to be the people who engage in inelegant behavior, like sticking our nose under the tent to see what the grand poobahs are planning for us. It's an indignity. It's hard to do. And it becomes very difficult to do that if you're sucking up to the people you're covering.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And the rest of the team we've got, and the man of the hour. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. This is a show in remembrance of a great American, Phil Donahue.
That's right. Today we pay tribute to the late, great Phil Donahue, the man who back in 1967 essentially invented the daytime TV talk show with The Phil Donahue Show. And because it was based in Dayton, Ohio, they had difficulty getting celebrity guests. So the program had to discuss issues. They featured hot-button social issues that had previously been taboo: feminism, birth control, gay rights, civil rights, the church, and religion in all its various flavors, and of course, consumer protection. That's how Ralph met Phil. No one appeared on The Donahue Show more than Ralph Nader, bringing to a mainstream audience so many issues Ralph worked on in the public interest. We're going to talk to Ralph about that, and then Ralph is going to talk to three guests about their experiences with Phil Donahue. First up, we'll speak with Joan Claybrook, who worked with Ralph and continues to work on auto safety issues. Then we'll also speak with Michael Jacobson, one of the founders for the Center for Science in the Public Interest, who works on food safety. And finally, we'll welcome back Jeff Cohen, who was senior producer of MSNBC's Phil Donahue Show until it was terminated on the eve of the Iraq War. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our tireless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, here's a clip of Phil reflecting on his most frequent guest.
Ralph and I go back to Unsafe, the 60s. And in 67, when I got my show, hanging on as I was, local show, I wanted Ralph more than any other guest. I just thought that was the damnedest thing I ever heard. General Motors sending women after him to trap him so they got, holy, what? I was absolutely stunned by this. And I guess you have to say I loved a good story. And this sure was. And I called Ralph.
So, Ralph, tell us about your experience with Phil Donahue.
Well, it was a wonderful experience, and it informed millions of people on various strivings for a more just society, health, safety, freedom of information, peace, and nobody did it like Phil. You know, before Phil, the talk show hosts just dealt with fluff and entertainment celebrities. Phil did entertainment because he had to keep an audience, but he also had hundreds of shows on serious topics. He always believed if something was important, it could be made interesting to people. So he's the first one to go into the audience and let the audience ask questions with his mic. And then he'd open up in the middle of the program to phone calls from his national TV audience, which was about 10 million people at the time. And he did another thing that nobody has done since. He lets people who have important reports, like Sid Wolf's Worst Pills, Best Pills, hundreds of pharmaceuticals approved by the FDA, but some had bad side effects and some had minimal side effects, namely Worst Pills, Best Pills, to be sold. They were all sold to a nonprofit, that was a time a public citizen, and they were sold at a very reasonable price. And on one show, Sid Wolf sold 500,000 copies. That would never happen today. Because Phil knew that it wasn't just important to reach people on his show, that he had to have them accessible to materials that elaborated it in greater detail. And he did that for lots of people. But it all started with his sense of the purpose of the media and a public philosophy of justice for all. And was he ever a driver, energy? I mean, to get me on the show, from a little station in Dayton at a time when I was on the national media all the time. Took some doing. He got my phone number and my $90 a month boarding room in the outside hall. He would call. He would say, I'm on a small station, Ralph, but you'll turn me into a big act. And you couldn't turn him down. And that's the way he got a lot of guests. He even would drive to the airport to see him off. Can you imagine a talk show host, a national talk show host doing that today? One time there was a huge snowstorm in Dayton, and we had finished the show, and he was worried about the plane being delayed and et cetera. And he drove us to the airport and stayed with us until we got on the plane. There was nobody like Phil Donahue. He had competitors, Mike Douglas and Merv Griffin, and they had some good shows because they saw the competition. They saw the ratings that Phil got on important subjects of public interest. So, in summary, I called him and continue to call him the greatest enabler and defender of the First Amendment right of free speech in American history. Someone will say, what? What do you mean? You mean no judges, no constitutional law professor, no elected member of Congress? Correct. Given the frequency of his programs, he had over 6,000 television programs in his near 30-year career on national TV. Given the frequency of his programs and the number of people he gave voice to, the leaders of the social justice movements aborning in the 60s and 70s, women's rights, environment, consumer, worker health and safety, war resistors, like against the Vietnam War, gay rights. He had them all on. Workplace safety was one of his concerns, civil rights, and student rebels, aggrieved communities. He put on victims, too, not just leaders of social justice movements, because he wanted their story firsthand to reach millions of people. So he was far more than an entertainment show with flamboyant performers. He had the deepest understanding of the First Amendment of anybody I've ever met. And the reason is that not only did he have these voiceless leaders and victims on his show that other media would avoid, like the plague. It would upset their advertisers. It would upset their corporate bosses. He would have people on whose views he vehemently disagreed with. When I asked him, Phil, why do you have Jerry Falwell of the Moral Majority on? He had Falwell on over 24 times, an hour each time. These were not short interviews. And he said, because they have a right to reach people. And besides, if you disagree with them, the more you put them on TV, the more people will know what they're up to. So he fought for the right of people to be on his show whose views he vehemently disagreed with. Now, that is the ultimate test of someone who believes in the First Amendment. He was so kind and generous. He wrote a book about his show when he was at the peak of his popularity, and he took his staff all over the country before huge audiences to promote the book, and he gave his staff all the royalties. He was a complete human being. It's so sad to see that he's no longer with us, and so tragic because there's nobody like him on national TV, nobody like him remotely like him. They now deal with shows featuring sadism, masochism, who's cheating against who. They have bouncers. They tell people to shout and scream during the intercession because they don't think they're vigorous enough. And they never have people who are challenging corporate power, government abuse, and who are espousing the great issues of humankind, the way Phil did. He even went to Chernobyl at his own risk. That was the place where there was a nuclear partial meltdown in Ukraine. And he showed the creaking doors of the abandoned towns that were radioactive and will be for a long time. He would go and interview citizens of the Soviet Union directly. So he was really a reporter. He wasn't just someone sitting in a big room with an audience and a microphone.
Ralph, you appeared on his show more than anyone else. And later on for our podcast listeners, we're going to play some of those clips in the wrap up. Is there any particular episode or appearance that stands out to you where you appeared?
Well, they were all so wonderful and outstanding and controversial. He would challenge me, after I would get some applause. He didn't like just constant applause for any of his guests. And he'd look at me and he'd say, "Don't you ever feel that you're too messianic, too single-minded?" He was great with questions like that. Nothing really stands out because, Steve, everything stood out. I mean, there were sometimes gasps in the audience because the questions were so personal by people who were victimized by issues and conditions that I was talking about. But he did one time put me in a compromising situation. He called up and he said, "Ralph, we're having a show and we don't like your drab suits. They don't show well on TV. So we're going to have a tailor produce a really avant-garde tailored suit for you with shoes and everything and handkerchiefs." And so I said to myself, what am I going to do here? I mean, I'm not going on the show as an actor. But, he was always a good sport. So I was a good sport. So he dressed me up in this, must have been $1,000 suit from some fancy store in New York. And people had a good time talking about what he did to me, because I guess I was sort of notorious for having the same army shoes on and the same drab suits. So
yes, you were sort of notorious for that.
Yeah, he did say something interesting to people. He said, "Putting Ralph Nader on, I'm not doing him any favors. He's doing us a favor." By which he meant I got him high ratings. And usually the way people kept me off TV is they say nobody wants to hear about this gloom and doom. They want to hear about happiness and excitement and celebrities and places to go and things like that. In Hollywood, he showed that if the subject was important to people, it was his job to make it fascinating and interesting and engrossing and interactive with them. And he did that. That was one of his great contributions. He also would make speeches on the First Amendment. He couldn't stand censorship. He couldn't stand shutting people up. As I said, even people he disagreed with.
Thanks for that, Ralph. Our first guest, Joan Claybrook, headed the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration during the Carter administration. And in that capacity, she appeared on The Donahue Show.
Well, the major and most important test was with a dummy inside the car representing a human being and trying to see whether or not they'd be injured or killed in a crash at a speed in excess of our standard. Our standard is 30 miles an hour, and these tests were at 35.
With the emphasis on the occupant protection. We don't care about property, we care about people.
That's right.
So which cars then do the best job of protecting the person inside?
That's right.
Let's show this film. This is test film of a Chevy Citation crash, is it not?
That's correct.
All right. The first crash you'll see here is at 35 miles an hour. Watch the dummy inside.
That's right. Now, what you want is to have the car absorb the energy but not crush into the passenger compartment.
That's at 35, and the Chevy Citation passed.
The Chevy Citation passed.
Watch this crash at 48. Wham!
Now you can see that the car does not keep intrusion out of the passenger compartment. It comes into the passenger compartment, and that's where you're likely to have severe damage to the human beings inside.
Oh, I see. Oh, yes.
Joan Claybrook is one of the public interest champions of the modern consumer movement. She is president emeritus of Public Citizen. Prior to becoming president of Public Citizen, Ms. Claybrook was head of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration during the Carter administration from 1977 to 1981. She founded and ran Public Citizen's Congress Watch Division and worked for the Public Interest Research Group, the National Traffic Safety Bureau, the Social Security Administration, and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Joan Claybrook.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Joan. When you were head of the Auto Safety Regulatory Agency under Jimmy Carter, you came up with this idea of informing people about their cars, the defects, by make and model name. In those days, it was controversial to refer on the media to cars by make and model, but you wanted to provide a new way to reach people. Why don't you discuss why this was important and also what the format of the car book was.
Well, first of all, I felt that the public would help the agency do its job by being more informed about what kind of cars to buy and also knowing about what cars had safety defects. So I asked the top staff of the agency if we could put something together, and they all said it was impossible. So then I asked the head of the administration under me to find anybody that was working at the agency who had a master's degree in public affairs of some sort. And they came up with a guy named Jack Gillis, who, when I told him I wanted to do a booklet on car safety and by make and model so that people could go with it to the dealer when they bought their car and know what kind of problem they had or didn't have, then he got some help, went out and got some contractors, and came back with something that we called the car book. Very simple. And it listed every, except some very expensive ones, it listed every car made in America and how they performed in our crash tests. We did crash tests to set safety standards. And the way that we publicized it was on the Donahue show. And so when Donahue called and said he wanted me to come and talk about car safety, I said that I wanted to bring with me an experimental safety vehicle that we had put together, which looked like a Porsche. It was red, white, and blue, and it crashed safe at 50 miles an hour. Most cars didn't crash safely at even 30 or 25 miles an hour at that time. And so we took the car, and then I said, and we have a booklet that I'd like to publicize so that the public can have access to information when they go to the car dealership. And so Donahue really promoted that book. He loved the book, and he is a great promoter. And 400,000 people requested copies. It completely overwhelmed the government printing office system that was out of Pueblo, Colorado. They'd never had so many orders at one time in the history of the organization. So we were incredibly pleased, but we didn't have 400,000 copies available. So we had to rush to the printer, get more copies, transfer money so that we had enough money to pay for it. And it was a smashing success. And Donahue was so probing and got the audience involved in asking about safety defects and how you figure out what to do about it.
And it was free, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, the booklet was free. And as it happened, about a couple of years later, Public Citizen, I guess about 10 years later, Public Citizen published a book called Worst Pills, Best Pills that we sold for $10. It was a great big book, but we sold it for $10, our costs. And Sid Wolf was the doctor who put it together. And 400,000 copies were paid for by the audience at that time. So Donahue was a great source of help to getting information out to the public that they really wanted. And no one else would publicize it. And we would have never been able to get the car book off the ground with a regular publisher.
And you had other information in the car book, how to report defects, how to connect with your auto safety agency. You had a lot of other useful information other than just cars by make and model. And you included imported cars, not just cars produced in America, didn't you?
All cars sold in America.
It's fair to say you couldn't have gotten on other national TV talk shows with something so controversial as naming make and model and associating them with their defects, correct?
Oh, absolutely correct. And I barely got through the Department of Transportation because the auto industry, right after the show, came and complained bitterly to the Secretary of Transportation that I had no authority to do this. What? I had no authority to publish a book with information that was already public if someone asked us and we had to write letters. So they tried to kill the car book right after it first came out. And then when the administration changed shortly thereafter, this was in the fall of 1980, when the administration changed and Reagan came in, they wouldn't republish the book. And so Jack Gillis, the author at the Department of Transportation for me, who put this book together, quit and privately published it. And he was able to do that because we already had 400,000 copies of the book circulating throughout America. And Donahue was interested in, so he had another show and helped to continue to promote it. And that book has been published for almost 40 years now on the internet.
Well, that's what was great about Phil Donahue. He got a lot of pushback from his advertisers after he had you on, but he still had Jack Gillis on a few years later So he was not about to be intimidated. Another example of what a great media person and believer in the freedom of people to know things that were necessary for their health and safety and livelihoods. Steve, or anybody want to ask Joan a question?
I guess the question I want to ask is, what happened to his audience? Who do we have now?
I think his audience is still there. I really do. And I think people still want consumer information as much today as they ever did. In fact, even more, because things have gotten more complicated, more technical, and car safety is very technical. And what we did was we translated that technical information into a format and a kind of material that the public could understand, so that when they went to the dealer to buy a car or a used car, by the way, not only new cars, but used cars, they had this information available to them originally in the car book, then on the internet, and also at the dealership under this price sticker that was required since the 50s. And it added in the information about the way the car performed in crash tests. Crash tests are very complicated, and it needs the government to translate and to do first to do the tests, and then to translate that information so the public can understand how well this car performs, that car performs in relationship to the others, and it's like in the same price range, for example, so that the public has a choice.
We've been talking with Joan Claybrook, former auto industry regulator under Jimmy Carter and later Public Citizens president. Joan, just so our listeners can understand, the work of auto safety is still being carried on by the Center of Auto Safety and the Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety, which you work with frequently. Can you briefly describe those two groups?
They're two excellent groups. The Center for Auto Safety was founded with your help and Consumers Union back in 1969. And for 40-some years, Clarence Ditlow was the head of it. He was an engineer and a lawyer, and he was as determined as any human being you'll ever meet to help people get safe cars and to require the auto industry to behave and recall cars and also meet safety standards and new and important safety standards. The most important safety standard that I issued was with the Secretary of Transportation, of course, was on airbags. And it had a long and controversial career with lawsuits filed by the auto industry. And we eventually succeeded in the only way that I knew how to solve the problem, which was to get some legislation passed in the early 1990s that required airbags in every single vehicle that the public uses, the SUVs and cars and so on. And the Center for Auto Safety played an important role in that, as did Advocates, which was founded in 1989 with the insurance industry and is funded by the insurance industry because they benefit from having safer cars in terms of their costs. And so they make a donation every year to various companies to fund Advocates, although I think they're very measly in the amount of money that they give. We love working with them because they have access to different places that we don't, the consumer groups don't, and they have very good judgment in terms of how to secure these improvements in cars.
On that note, thank you very much, Joan Claybrook, for your continuing work in this area and for bringing back the memories of what Phil Donahue did for auto safety in those days.
Among many, many, many other things that he did.
We've been speaking with Joan Claybrook. We will link to her work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Our next guest appeared on The Donahue Show and got gasps from his audience. David?
Michael Jacobson holds a PhD in microbiology from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he co-founded and then led the Center for Science and the Public Interest for 4 decades. Dr. Jacobson is the author of Salt Wars, the battle over the biggest killer in the American diet, and he is the founder of the National Food Museum. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Mike Jacobson.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Mike, you were on the Phil Donahue Show, and you had an exhibit that produced millions of gasps out there to describe how much fat is in a double cheeseburger, etc. Why don't you give us the background and what it was like with Phil Donahue?
Sure. Well, back then at Center for Science and the Public Interest in the 1970s, we worked on nutrition and really made that a topic of great discussion at a time when the whole nutrition community said, there is no problem. Americans are doing fine. Just eat a variety of foods in moderation and you'll be fine. And I'd say, moderation? You mean like sugar frosted flakes in the morning with whole milk and Burger King in the afternoon and Pizza Hut in the evening? That's quite a variety, but it's all junk. And Americans were suffering, are still suffering from a heart disease epidemic and hypertension and other problems related to diet. So that was the environment back then. And I published a couple of books on food additives and nutrition and posters on food additives and nutrition. And Phil kindly invited me on this TV show, possibly thanks to Ralph. I'm not sure if you were pushing me behind the scenes. And I'd get on the show and talking about nutrition, and I would bring my usual props. There were graduated cylinders filled with the amounts of fat in different restaurant meals. And typically there would be 5 to 10 teaspoons of fat in these graduated cylinders that I would brandish in front of Phil's live audience, and there would be gas from everybody, including Phil. And that got a huge amount of attention, and which was great for people to be learning about what they were eating. And it was great for us because Phil was a great salesman and let me talk about how people could buy those books and posters. And I think we charged $1.50 and sold tens of thousands, which were just an enormous help to the organization. I only wish we charged $2 instead of $1.50, and we would have been in Fat City. But such were my abilities as a business person.
And you just gave an example of what the response was from the national audience, which showed how much they also trusted Phil to put guests on like you. Were you able to show the amount of fat that goes down people's gullet from cheeseburgers and other fat-filled products on other talk shows or other TV shows? Or was Phil, as usual, one-of-a-kind opportunity?
No, in this case, he wasn't one of a kind. We had tremendous publicity in newspapers, radio, television, magazines, and so often these columnists or hosts allowed me to, or they would do it themselves, publicize a few examples of how junky these foods were and tell people how they could buy the book or the poster. So there were a few instances, and I don't remember who, but a few instances where I wasn't permitted to mention brand names. So I could talk about hamburgers, even fast food hamburgers, but not mention McDonald's or Burger King. But Phil, regardless of that, Phil really was one of a kind, where he studied up on the topic, he knew it thoroughly, he was smart, he was generous, kind, thoughtful, asked good questions. So it was just a wonderful, positive experience for various reasons to be on his terrific daytime TV show.
He was never reluctant to let his guests talk about brand names, makes, and models of automobiles right from the beginning. But for listeners to get a flavor of what occurs on a live national TV show, I mean, can you imagine? It's live. Any kind of trip up or any kind of slip up could really mess up the show, unlike so many of today's shows, which are scripted. And I once asked him, you're going live, you choose to go live, you have a live audience, you have live calls from your TV audience. What is it like? Because everything has to go well in order to make it happen. And there's so many bad things that could happen. And he looked at me and he said, Ralph, the Phil Donahue show is a 1-hour nightmare. By which he said, any minute, some guest, some call, whatever, could have gone off the rails. But he's willing to take the risk because he was so spontaneous and open and candid and authentic. Another aspect of his greatness.
Yeah, let me give you an example of how different things were then on his show. Maybe 10 years ago, I was on Dr. Oz's TV show, which wasn't formally scripted, but his producers went through with me exactly what they wanted to hear on the topics, what my responses would be, and didn't want any deviation from that. And I knew that if I deviated, I'd never be on a show again. So there was an incentive to stick to the semi-script. Donahue wasn't anything like that. And I must say, other shows like Colbert or Oprah weren't like that either. So maybe Oz was the exception, not the rule.
Well, Donahue set the mode. He set the path forward. He opened the windows that others followed. And Oprah Winfrey just said, after the news of the passing of Phil Donahue at the age of 88, said without Phil Donahue, there wouldn't have been an Oprah Winfrey show, which is a very fine and true compliment that Oprah directed toward Phil. We've been speaking with Dr. Michael Jacobson, co-founder of the Center for Science and Public Interest, which publishes the newsletter Nutrition Action that goes to hundreds of thousands of people. And we wish him good luck on his newest venture, which is to build a national food museum as a powerful, muscular, constant education of the public about the importance of a good diet for a good livelihood, for good health, for good safety, and for good environment. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you so much, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Mike Jacobson. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we'll speak to Jeff Cohen about his years working alongside Phil Donahue. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, August 23, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Humana, a healthcare insurance company that contracts with Medicare to provide Medicare Part D prescription drug plans, will pay $90 million to the federal government to settle a whistleblower lawsuit filed under the False Claims Act. The lawsuit alleges that Humana submitted fraudulent bids to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services for lucrative Medicare Part D prescription drug contracts, significantly overcharging the government. The Part D program depends on insurance companies paying their minimum share of drug costs, said Claire Sylvia, a lawyer representing the whistleblower. We argued that Humana shirked its responsibility by telling the government that its plan would cover drug costs that Humana did not actually plan to cover. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Our final guest was a senior producer on the Phil Donahue Show until it was terminated on the eve of the Iraq War.
Corporate ownership is, I think, the biggest challenge to a robust media featuring all kinds of voices. It lives, and I ought to know. I lost my job because I opposed the invasion of Iraq. And
this is on MSNBC.
Right, owned by General Electric at the time, one of the biggest defense contractors in the world. And here they got this ex-talk show guy on their own station criticizing the decision to go to war and invade Iraq. And so, I was gone like a week or so before the invasion. It was definitely a corporate hit.
In 2003, Phil Donahue was fired from his primetime MSNBC talk show during the run-up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. It was the most popular talk show on MSNBC at the time. The problem wasn't Phil's ratings, but rather his views. An internal MSNBC memo warned Donahue was a, quote, difficult public face for NBC in a time of war, providing a, quote, home for the liberal anti-war agenda at the same time that our competitors are waving the flag at every opportunity, unquote.
I think there's a lot of evidence out there that they feel a bit guilty about what they did to me. Because shortly after I was fired, most of their employees who had a show opposed the invasion of Iraq. Bush was wrong for bombing crowded cities at night where old people and children were sleeping. And America even, the majority of people came around to believe that this was a massive blunder by Bush.
And now we're going to talk to a man who is there, can elaborate on all of that. David?
Jeff Cohen is co-founder and policy director at Roots Action. He is a media critic, columnist, documentary filmmaker, and retired journalism professor who founded the media watch group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, back in 1986. For years, he was a regular pundit on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, discussing issues of media and politics. And he is the author of Cable News Confidential, My Misadventures in Corporate Media. He was senior producer of MSNBC's Phil Donahue show until it was terminated on the eve of the Iraq War. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jeff Cohen.
Nice to be with you. I wish it was under different circumstances.
Well, you were a close friend and co-worker with Phil Donahue, especially when MSNBC launched his show in 2002. And it only lasted 6 months, as Phil said, just before the criminal invasion of Iraq by Bush and Cheney occurred in late March of 2003. And it was a pretty awful situation of corporate censorship and conflict of interest. General Electric was a military contractor. It owned NBC, which spawned MSNBC. And so the claws of the corporate octopus went deep into MSNBC, and you saw it all firsthand. Why don't you tell our listeners a bit about what occurred and how quickly they ended the show?
Yeah, we felt those claws of corporate power from day one. We were talking to MSNBC in about April of 2002. They gave us assurances when we were hired that we would have complete editorial control. We could counter-program against Bill O'Reilly. We could put on the guests we wanted to put on. They're the kind of guests that you have on your show, Ralph, and Amy Goodman has on Democracy Now! That's what we had in mind. By the time we went on the air, which was until July of 2002, management had completely gone back on all of their promises. And I feel a little guilty because I was one of the people pushing Phil to get back on the air. You know, it was in the wake of 9/11 and, you know, let's bomb some country. I don't care who we bomb. And Phil was one of the people who could get on television with a message of let's be smart against terrorism instead of being, quote, tough on terrorism that just breeds more terrorists. So I feel a little guilty because we went over to MSNBC. They sold us a bill of goods. We should have known better. By the time the show began in July, and Ralph, I was on the phone with you complaining about management's ridiculous orders and directives from day one. But at the beginning...
Yeah, you got to tell our listeners, this is really amazing, listeners, the requirements that they imposed on.
Yeah, initially, everything had to be balanced. If we had an anti-war point of view, we had to make sure there was someone out shouting them who was pro-war. And it was balance, balance, balance. And it really wrecked the show. It turned the show into shouting matches. Then it got worse as the Iraq invasion approached, when management basically took over our show and they ordered us who could get on and who couldn't. And they implemented a quota system. If we booked one guest who was against the impending invasion of Iraq, we had to book two that were pro-war. If we had two guests on the left, we needed three on the right. At one meeting of producers, a producer was excited and said, I think I could book Michael Moore. She was told for political balance, she would need three right-wingers to balance Michael, who was seen as obviously he was already a critic of the stupidity and the immorality of going forward with the war against Iraq. So they basically took over the show. They were ordering us to put people on the air that weren't even allowed on Fox News. They were so right-wing. We had Jared Taylor from American Renaissance, almost a neo-fascist eugenicist group. He was on the air a couple times. When they got rid of Phil, they hired Michael Savage, a racist, sexist talk radio guy who was too far right to be on Fox News. So management wrecked the show, and then they terminated the show 3 weeks before the invasion of Iraq. And remember, they terminated us right after the biggest anti-war marches in history, global history up till that point. And obviously, there was a huge audience if they had allowed Phil Donahue to be Phil Donahue. and put on the experts that we wanted to put on, and we would have gotten huge ratings, but they ruined the show. They hurt our ratings. And Amy's right that when we were terminated, in spite of all of management's interference, we were still the most watched program on MSNBC. Management doesn't usually cancel their most watched television show, but they did it at MSNBC. And I want to say something I haven't been able to say anywhere else. We didn't know for a few months, why was management being so crazy? Why would they not allow even 1 hour of dissenting views about whether it would be wise to invade Iraq? And we learned about it months later. We realized that the top executives and lobbyists for General Electric, which owned MSNBC, and Disney, which owned ABC, and Murdoch, that owned Fox, they were all lobbying Bush's FCC, Federal Communications Commission, to allow big media conglomerates to get even bigger. And so the pressure that was imposed on the Phil Donahue show, it didn't come from even in our building. It came from the lobbyists and the top executives of General Electric. They didn't want to do anything resembling journalism that might offend Bush Cheney, because that might impact the ability of these media conglomerates to grow even bigger. And you'll remember the head of the FCC at the time was Michael Powell, Colin Powell's son.
Well, the whole interference inside the show by the higher-ups, the suits, as Phil would call them, was done very furtively. So just for the record, Jeff Cohen, put some names on these people. Who were they in NBC and General Electric who pulled the strings?
Yeah, I mean, Bob Wright was the General Electric executive that they put in charge of NBC, and he came from General Electric Plastics Division. We know he's a conservative. He gave Roger Ailes management of CNBC. Bob Wright came to run NBC and all of these channels after being in General Electric Plastics. So I guess that gave him his credibility to run TV networks. But Bob Wright was the problem. We were dealing immediately in our building with Eric Sorensen, who was, the head of MSNBC at the time. He didn't last too long. I mean, they were trying to outfox Fox. When they got rid of us, it was just, can we wave the flag more heartily than even Fox? And when you're waving flags, you can't do journalism. You don't have the energy, if you're waving the flag so vigorously, to do the journalism of asking the tough questions of the powers that be before our young people are sent over to kill or be killed. But, we did some great things in the first few weeks. Ralph, you might remember you and Molly Ivins when Enron melted down. We had a town meeting from Texas with you and Molly and all these laid off Enron employees. When Michael Moore did his premiere in his hometown of Flint, Michigan, of the great movie Bowling for Columbine, we did an hour show from Flint. On Labor Day, 2002, we had a whole hour with Barbara Ehrenreich talking about how hard it is to make ends meet when you're working for minimum wage. It was based on her book, Nickel and Dime. And it was one of the first times in months, we were new to MSNBC, that anyone at MSNBC had beaten CNN in the ratings. We did that with Barbara Ehrenreich on Labor Day. So, I mean, we are able to accomplish some good things at the beginning. We tried to book Scott Ritter, the United Nations weapons inspector, and we would be told, oh, don't you know? He's taking money from Saddam Hussein, which was a smear. We put Ramsey Clark, who is quite eloquent, former U.S. Attorney General, on the air, and he denounced the legality of invading Iraq, and he's not exactly a slouch in that field. And the next morning, we hear from management, oh, you guys screwed up. Ramsey Clark's never supposed to appear on our network. There was, again, this was 2003. It felt like 1953 during the Joe McCarthy witch hunts. So at the end, they were basically dictating we had to put all of these right-wingers on. Whenever we had a good guest, they couldn't even be heard. And it was embarrassing. And the good news is that the day after we were canceled and management lied, as corporate management always does, management lied and they said, oh, it's just about ratings. And then these memos and emails, internal memos and emails that were never supposed to go public, they all leaked. They talked about how their fear that Donahue, this is a quote, will become the home of the liberal anti-war agenda at the same time that our competitors are waving the flag at every opportunity, unquote. And so we know why we were terminated. It was naked politics because we were trying to practice journalism during a time of war. It's all been proven by these internal memos. They got public. And what's sickening to me, reading the obituaries, is how many news outlets were still writing in the year 2024 that Phil's MSNBC show was canceled for poor ratings. It sickens me. I've been contacting these obituary writers. You got it wrong. Here's the reality. This was published within a week of the show being terminated. It was all politics. By the way, those internal memos and emails, they didn't mention the word ratings. It was all about war. He's coming across as too combative. You know, he's a difficult public face for NBC in a time of war. That's what the memos said. And so it sickens me that the news media can't even get it right 20 years later.
Well, fortunately, the Post in its second edition obituary did get it right. Jeff, before we close, just to give it a sense of the flavor, the show had about 12, 15 full-time staff. There were desks. It was a large room, camera equipment, files. How many days did General Electric NBC give Phil Donahue to clear out after they told him he was done?
I think it was a day. I mean, it was very sudden. We knew it was going to be difficult to persist as the war got nearer, and they canceled the show 3 weeks before with almost no notice. And by the way, Ralph, the Washington Post obituary finally getting it right. They did a good job, but the New York Times didn't, Associated Press didn't, Boston Globe didn't. I can't believe that 20 years later, the news media, which in general performed so badly in the run-up to the Iraq invasion, they can't even get it right why the Phil Donahue show was canceled. It was pure politics. Everyone knows it. Anyone who looks at it would know it. And yet you've got mainstream journalists still getting it wrong in 2024.
Well, maybe you can get one or two of them to have a corrections item.
I've tried. I've been trying. You know, you're the one who called me with the sad news that Phil had died. And I immediately, wrote up what really happened. And then I started seeing these obituaries in mainstream media that were wrong. And I've been sending notices as widely as I could to every obituary writer. You should correct the record. And, after we were terminated at Donahue Show and I wrote the book, Cable News Confidential, I started hearing from all of these other journalists, local, state, national, who also lost their jobs during that very same period. And the most interesting email I ever received after the book came out was from Governor Jesse Ventura, the former governor of Minnesota. He was the one who was supposed to replace Phil Donahue. When they got rid of us, they said the show will now be hosted in that time slot by Governor Jesse Ventura. And why didn't his show get started? Because they realized Jesse Ventura was as skeptical and opposed to the Iraq war as Phil Donahue had been. So they paid Jesse Ventura millions of dollars never to go on the air. They paid him for several years, millions of dollars, and he never started the show. So again, when a country goes to war, that's when you really need journalism. And journalism failed us in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. It's failing us today with the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza.
Yes, and Mr. Biden doesn't object to Netanyahu blocking U.S. journalists and other journalists, including Israelis, from going into Gaza to report what's really going on there and tell American taxpayers what their dollars are being used for in the massive slaughter and massacre of hundreds of thousands of people there. Jeff Cohen, you know and I know, and the listeners know, that this is not a unique episode. It may have been a high visibility episode of corporate media censorship, but the corporations usually block these viewpoints before they even have a chance to get on the air. So it's done in a very furtive manner and not publicized, but it goes on every day of every year. You can make a list of taboo subjects that corporations would tell their media people, don't you have these people on the show at all. They turn them into non-persons.
You're right, Ralph.
Steve?
Jeff, my question is, talk about Phil at a production meeting. Talk about how those were run, sort of what, his presence, his influence. Just give us a flavor of behind the scenes there.
Look, Phil was a beloved figure. He was loved by his producers. I saw that when I was a guest on the daytime show in the 90s. I saw it in 2002 and 3 at MSNBC. He's the kind of leader you want to work with. And people worked their asses off. And everyone was frustrated at the MSNBC show. I mean, the beauty of the daytime show where Ralph and Gloria Steinem and Jesse Jackson were regular guests, he had autonomy. He could, it was syndicated and he was sort of, in many ways, his own boss. At MSNBC, we had to deal with Suitville, what Phil called the suits. And they gave us crazy orders, which we couldn't quite understand. They made no sense in terms of building audience. And they only made sense months later when we realized they were all in fear. They wanted something from FCC and they got it. But yeah, Phil was a beloved leader. I've never heard a bad word about him from an employee or a former employee.
Well, just to conclude, let's conclude with his legacy. I have some suggestions I want to make to the family, and I'm sure you do too. If they approve, there should be a major journalism prize in his name, the Phil Donahue Journalism Prize, that's awarded every year. There should be seminars about Phil Donahue and freedom of speech taught at journalism schools. So anything you can add to that, Jeff, would be very good. We don't want his legacy to be only the 6,000 shows and the speeches he made. We want it to continue in a much more functional manner. So we'll see some people like Phil Donahue, who don't exist today in the mass media, come to the forefront.
Yeah, I'd like to see a new book about his legacy. I assume there will be some honors in his name. I'm getting calls from media from Canada to Australia to talk about Phil and especially what happened to him at MSNBC. And they've shown far more interest in other countries, the censorship against Phil Donahue, than from U.S. journalists. But yes, he's someone who should be an inspiration. There are a lot of people that go to journalism school or communication school and they specialize in TV, radio. That's where we need people to understand what Phil did, because issues of consumer rights back in the 70s, gay rights, civil rights, women's equality, those were not discussed in mainstream media much. And he was doing it week after week. So he really helped change our country in a very progressive and positive direction.
He also opened up the ravages of poverty in our country and the victims and the people who are trying to do something about it. When the rest of the media would only refer to the middle class, they would never refer to the poor.
Right. He went inside prisons, federal prison with cameras. And, I remember at the time, news media would sometimes ridicule him. He wants to show an execution on his show. He wants to be able to film. He fought legally. It wasn't because he wanted, it wasn't a ratings gimmick. Phil was opposed to the death penalty. He was for criminal justice, not criminal injustice. And he wanted to show this is what the state does when it takes someone who's no harm to society, no threat to society, and the state executes this and extinguishes this human life. I mean, there wasn't an issue that Phil didn't care about. Curiosity did not kill that cat. He was curious about everything, and he was able to exude that curiosity. The viewers of his shows were so interested because they knew if Phil was interested, he could make it interesting. And thankfully, he made all these important social justice issues. He made them clear for so many millions of viewers. That's why he was a threat. That's why he was a threat.
Well, on that point, thank you very much. We've been talking with Jeff Cohen, who has a long career of defending free speech, teaching students about it, writing about it. and working on it to this very day. His most recent civic group that he helped co-found is called Roots Action. You want to give that website so people can get more information about that?
Yes, rootsaction.org. We sponsored the Step Aside Joe campaign, which was ultimately successful. And the other group, fair.org, FAIR, for media criticism. And Ralph's been a big supporter of both groups. And thanks, Ralph, to you and the whole team there.
Many thanks to you again. And let's keep Phil Donahue's legacy alive in all kinds of ways, all kinds of directions.
Thanks, Ralph.
I want to thank our guests again, Joan Claybrook, Mike Jacobson, and Jeff Cohen. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. Plus, we'll have a lot of other clips of Ralph on The Donahue Show. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. We have a new issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen. It's out now. To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. A lot of Phil's programs led to congressional hearings. We will have a tribute to Phil Donahue in the next issue, the Capitol Citizen. If you want to get the new one just out, go to capitolcitizen.com.
Dissent is very difficult in this country. We have a media which is rewarded by telling people what they want to hear. And that's not our job. We're not supposed to be popular. We're not supposed to be extolled as wonderful people who make us happy. We have to show the pain. And we are obliged to say what we feel about the decisions of powerful people.